Thank you. Thank you all. I think with that, in the interest of time, we'll move on to public comments and discussions. And so in order, and I would just ask everyone delivering a public comment to first introduce yourself and ask as well, declare any potential conflict of interest as defined in the policy. So just in order, we're going to start with Dr. Bernard Rubin. And sorry, I will just add that we have to limit people to 5 minutes, and I'm to be the enforcer of that 5-minute rule. So forgive me if I jump in.
Can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you so much.
So I have no changes to my conflict of interest statement. My name is Bernie Rubin, and I'm a rheumatologist and medical director in GlaxoSmithKline's immunoinflammation therapy area. Speaking on behalf of my GSK colleagues, I thank ICER for the opportunity to make public comments on their review of lupus nephritis treatments, including GSK's belimumab. We also thank the ICER staff for their collegial interactions over the past 7 months and acknowledge the substantial effort that went into this assessment. During my 30-year career as a practicing rheumatologist prior to joining GSK, I regularly saw both the catastrophic sudden onset of lupus nephritis in my patients, as well as the equally devastating slowly progressive kidney inflammation that can occur in patients with SLE. In either case, the onset of lupus nephritis disrupted their lives, affecting their well-being, work, home life, and interpersonal relationships. Even in the best of circumstances, only half of lupus nephritis patients achieve remission, subjecting those who do not reach this milestone to slowly progressive kidney failure and potential dialysis, thus highlighting the desperate need for new treatments. GSK is committed to delivering high-value, high-quality treatments to patients, and we remain committed to the lupus community with the recent FDA approval of belimumab, both IV and subcutaneous, for the treatment of lupus nephritis. The findings of the ICER evaluation of lupus nephritis treatments support the value of belimumab as a cost-effective therapy. However, limitations and uncertainties remain with ICER's assessment, including the following key elements. First, lupus nephritis is a complex disease that is difficult to model. At the core of every economic model is the assumption that the model is a simplification of a complex world. GSK is concerned that ICER's lupus nephritis economic model may not sufficiently capture the true and complex patient journey, thereby underestimating the value of interventions aimed at improving the lives of lupus nephritis patients. Models should seek to appropriately account for all benefits that medicines have in this disease to the extent possible. GSK urges ICER to acknowledge this limitation both in its final report and the executive summary. Second, it is critical to capture the entire range of treatment benefits. GSK appreciates ICER's scenario analysis that accounted for the societal perspective when determining cost per quality for belimumab. However, GSK believes that it does not fully account for the health-related quality of life and symptom burden of lupus nephritis on productivity and day-to-day activities, which extend to patients' family members, caregivers, friends, and employers. GSK once again urges ICER to acknowledge this point as a limitation to the model, both in its final report and the executive summary. Lastly, I would like to take this opportunity to provide additional suggestions as ICER develops its final report. Model outcomes should be reported as ranges rather than point estimates in order to reduce confusion among lay readers. Releasing the complete model methodology to avoid the perception of an opaque process. Given the many stakeholders involved, trust is ICER's most valued asset. Model limitations should be considered by CEPAC and later by ICER, not only in the body and appendix of the final report, but also in the executive summary, which will be read by a much wider audience. Consideration of these suggestions will provide both CEPAC and ICER with the opportunity to educate the public on the broader field of value assessment, rather than just the 2 drugs included in this review. To conclude, GSK again acknowledges ICER's efforts in conducting this assessment. We value collaboration with all stakeholders. Our company is committed to delivering high-value, high-quality treatments and welcome ICER's lupus nephritis evaluation. This evaluation supports the value of belimumab as a cost-effective therapy, offering patients with the devastating disease of lupus nephritis the potential to access much-needed innovative medications. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to comment on behalf of GSK.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin, and thank you for the extra 30 seconds that you just gave me. I guess in the interest of time, I'll just move on to the next manufacturer comment, and then we can have questions at the end. Next Certainly. Is Eric. Thank you. Next is Eric Turowski.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, and good morning, everyone. As the slide says, I'm Eric Turowski, Vice President of Market Access for Aurinia Pharmaceuticals, and there is no update to my conflict of interest. On behalf of my colleagues at Aurinia, I would also like to thank ICER and the review team for what we believe has been a very collaborative approach to this assessment over the last several months, and I thank you for the opportunity to share my comments today. Throughout this process, a lot of time and effort has been dedicated to the topics of cost effectiveness, and value. And we at Aurinia agree that these are certainly important topics, so much so that throughout our entire launch preparation, we invested heavily in cost effectiveness modeling and analysis to help guide our pricing decision for voclosporin, which I will now refer to as LUPKYNIS, a price that is consistent with the overall value that voclosporin or LUPKYNIS provides to patients, providers, and the overarching healthcare system. And while these topics are important, I urge this collective group, and especially the voting members, to not forget the essence of what we are truly discussing here today, which is providing access to life-changing and life-saving medications. LUPKYNIS offers truly unique clinical value, as we heard in the clinical evidence presentation. Within our clinical trials, patients on LUPKYNIS were 2.7 times more likely to achieve a complete response at 1 year with comparable adverse events and in the presence of low-dose steroids versus the standard of care alone. Proteinuria is the single greatest predictor of good long-term outcomes, and LUPKYNIS reduced proteinuria twice as fast as the standard of care alone. And LUPKYNIS displayed consistent efficacy across racial and ethnic subgroups. These facts deserve strong consideration as it relates to the discussion and vote on the long-term value of LUPKYNIS. From a modeling perspective, the evidence report assumes that patients that do not achieve a complete or partial response will remain on treatment for an average of 18 months. And for LUPKYNIS specifically, this assumption is not consistent with the vast amount of research that we've conducted from rheumatologists and nephrologists for really two main reasons. The first of which, that LUPKYNIS is very efficient at reducing the primary physician treatment marker, proteinuria. So therefore, a therapeutic benefit or lack thereof is relatively easy and quick to identify with LUPKYNIS. And considering the significant negative ramifications of LN, we don't expect or anticipate HCPs will accept failure for an average of 18 months with a product that they know can show a therapeutic benefit well before that time frame. So based on these points, we believe that a 6-month average duration for non-responders is a much more reasonable assumption. This change alone produces roughly a 20% reduction in the LUPKYNIS cost per quality adjusted life year and meaningfully enhances its cost effectiveness, as we saw very briefly in the evidence presentation earlier. And I want to highlight the fact that this scenario analysis, while it was briefly highlighted today, was not in the published report. And we urge ICER to publish this scenario in the final evidence report. Today, you'll be asked to vote on the overall long-term value for money of LUPKYNIS with consideration of the quality of life for patients and caregivers, its impact on health inequities, and its preservation of kidney function. When voting, we urge you to consider the unparalleled complete response rates LUPKYNIS achieved as an oral therapy at 1 year versus the standard of care. That those results were consistent across racial and ethnic subgroups where we know health inequities exist. And since proteinuria, again, being the single greatest predictor of good long-term outcomes in LN, please consider the speed at which LUPKYNIS reduces this marker. Lastly, as I just mentioned, consider the 6-month duration of therapy scenario analysis for non-responders relative to your cost effectiveness assessment. In summary, I'd like to thank the patients, advocates, providers, and analysts who contributed their valuable perspective to this vital research. We appreciate that the evidence report recognizes LUPKYNIS as an important new treatment option for LN and one that is cost effective. And we ask for your thoughtful consideration of our comments during your vote, recognizing the impact of this is not trivial. It can have a meaningful impact on access to a life-changing and life-saving medication. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then next is Dina Thachet. Are you on the?
Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you so much to the ICER community for allowing me to provide comments today. My name is Dina Thachet, and I'm a patient advocate representing Lupus and Allied Diseases Association, and I have no financial disclosures to provide. When I was 19 years old, I began having vague symptoms, including fatigue, weight loss, blood in my urine, and many other symptoms. Despite many tests, doctors couldn't find the cause, and I was repeatedly misdiagnosed, and often my symptoms were dismissed. A year later, I was diagnosed with severe endometriosis and needed an emergency laparoscopy. The surgeon presented birth control pills. The surgeon prescribed birth control pills to regulate my cycle. And the very day that I took the very first pill, I landed in the ER with meningitis and an E. coli intestinal infection. They treated me for 11 days and then sent me home, but I was back in the ER within 30 minutes. After a rheumatology consult, I was then diagnosed with SLE, and the pill was the actual trigger for my lupus. I was hospitalized for another 3 weeks in a full-blown flare with CNS, pericarditis, pleurisy, the works. I was diagnosed with stage 4 nephritis after a biopsy with kidney function at approximately 7 to 9%. During those 3 weeks, I was actually pronounced clinically dead 3 times and then given a 5-year prognosis. That was 27 years ago. Needless to say, here I am. I started taking high-dose steroids and immunosuppressives. While most of the inflammation resolved, the nephritis remained. I began monthly chemotherapy treatments for 1.5 years, and several years later for another 1.5 years. I've been on steroids and immunosuppressives for the entire 27 years since diagnosis, and am now experiencing the long-term side effects, including osteopenia, prediabetes, and GI issues, amongst other things. Now that I've shared a little bit about my lupus journey, I'd actually like to focus today on the impact of lupus treatments on quality of life issues, specifically on the impact on reproduction and parenthood. The majority of us diagnosed with lupus are of childbearing age, as has been stated by earlier presenters, many of whom one day wish to be parents. Many of the current treatments, including those that I've been on, are very toxic and have a detrimental impact on fertility, on the ability to get pregnant and to safely carry a pregnancy to term, as well as to have a healthy baby. For those who do become parents, the side effects can make daily life and raising the child difficult. This adds insult to injury when we are already dealing with diminished quality of life. Our hopes and dreams and our desire to be parents are just as important as treating our physical health and should be considered when determining a treatment plan. Those diagnosed today deserve treatment options that have little to no impact on fertility. I didn't have that option 27 years ago. I was told that I would and should never get pregnant, and that if I were to, that I and the baby would likely die. I was only 20 years old. I felt hopeless and didn't dare allow that dream to rekindle until it did. I worked with my rheumatologist and the MFM team to make sure that I was stable enough to even consider pregnancy and weighed the lupus-related risk factors. I began working with a reproductive endocrinologist only to find that the numerous procedures I underwent failed. Testing showed that my ovarian reserve was scientifically equivalent to 0 and a direct result of the chemotherapy treatments that I had taken years prior. I was devastated. While we continued to explore our options, it became increasingly difficult to maintain hope. In addition to depression and isolation, we suffered a tremendous financial burden on top of the ongoing financial burden of lupus treatments, even with really good insurance. This threatened our ability to consider continued fertility options, as well as other options such as adoption or surrogacy. And it also depleted our savings account. I would be remiss to not point out that all of this would be even more challenging, if not impossible, for anyone who is uninsured, underinsured, or on public aid, which many with lupus are due to not being able to work. All told, I experienced over 13 years of fertility challenges and heartbreaking losses. Excuse me. Sorry. That said, this is a story of hope and resilience. I'm beyond pleased to share that after those 13 years, I was finally able to get pregnant. At the age of 43, while high risk and far from easy, I carried a full-term pregnancy and am proud to introduce you to our little miracle, Isla. She is the biggest blessing of our lives. I truly hope that all those who are diagnosed with lupus are able to access treatments that allow them to become parents if that's part of their dream. At minimum, we deserve to have hope. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that very powerful talk. I know I said I'd defer comments, but I also just wanted to say very briefly that your daughter is beautiful, and I'm so happy to hear that. Next is Toni Grimes.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much.
I'm Toni Grimes and I have no conflicts. This month marks 14 years that I've been living and thriving with lupus. Don't get me wrong, I've had my fair share of ups and downs, but I must say lupus has definitely made me a stronger person. 14 years ago, I had no idea what lupus was, let alone the unmet needs for lupus-specific medications. This is an amazing time for lupus nephritis with regards to patients and providers having options for more personalized medicine for patients like myself. I want to take a brief moment to give you an understanding of my journey. I was diagnosed in 2007 at the height of my military career as an Army officer who was about to deploy to Iraq. After having trouble breathing, I was diagnosed with a pleural effusion. I underwent a thoracentesis to draw fluid off my lung, and that biopsy resulted in a positive ANA, and this began my ologist journey. After 16 vials of blood being drawn, I was officially diagnosed with lupus. This was a rarity because it takes on average 6 years to get diagnosed, and I was diagnosed within 1 month, basically the time frame of my follow-up appointment. It might have been quicker because I was in the Army and I was about to deploy. 2 months after diagnosis, my lung collapsed after a second thoracentesis. I had surgery to repair my lung the day of the unit deployed to Iraq. And 6 months post-op, I deployed to Afghanistan instead. Now, mind you, I was still new to this lupus way of life, and I thought I could take a pill and it'd be on my way. While I deployed, I was having a lot of lower left flank pain. After passing out multiple times in front of my soldiers due to that pain and mental health issues from my deployment, I was medevac back to the States. 3 months after returning home, I was diagnosed with lupus nephritis. That left flank pain and multiple urinalysis with high levels of protein turned out to be the early stages of kidney disease. I was diagnosed with stage 3 and stage 4 kidney disease during my journey. I was extremely fortunate to be serving my country at that time of diagnosis because I didn't have to worry about the cost of my medical care. I knew the military was going to cover it, and I didn't have to worry about taking sick leave or missing a paycheck. I remember switching from Celsep to Cytoxan. I was taking 6 pills a day, and I had just received a 90-day supply when my nephrologist changed my treatment plan because of non-response. I remember her mentioning that one of her patients was unable to get 1 Celsep pill a day because her insurance didn't want to cover it. But I had just received 540 pills from the mail order pharmacy. That patient's insurance would rather deny her 1 pill a day and allow her kidneys and quality of life to suffer. Because of her lack of access to care, she would have a higher probability of going on dialysis and hope to get on a kidney transplant list. This was so asinine to me. Due to my situation, I had unlimited access to care and she did not. That was in 2008. In 2009, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And in 2010, I was in the fight of my life. I was diagnosed with neuropsychiatric lupus psychosis and along with my post-traumatic stress disorder. After being hospitalized for 6 months in a semi-vegetative state, I had to learn how to walk, talk, and write again. This ultimately ended my career. In February of 2011, I was medically retired from the Army with 19 years, 2 months, and 29 days of service. When I took off my uniform, I replaced it with another one, a purple lupus cape, and this began my advocacy journey. Our journeys are very unique because lupus is like a fingerprint. No two lupus warriors are the same. This is why it is so important for lupus nephritis patients and providers to have treatment options. When I was diagnosed with lupus nephritis, there was no lupus-specific drugs. I was taking drugs that were meant for cancer patients, organ transplant recipients, and high-dose steroids, which to this day, I'm still suffering from its side effects 7 years after my last dose. I had to make a hard choice. I had to make hard decisions to take these drugs during my childbearing ages. These choices were heartbreaking and continue to haunt me today. Because of the horrible side effects, I was not able to be a mother that I wanted to be. Fast forward 13 years, we have not only one drug, but 2 drugs specific for lupus nephritis. When I retired in 2011, I attended my first lupus advocacy summit in DC, and Belesta just got FDA approved as the first and only biologic specific drug for lupus. Now in my lifetime, we have 2 more FDA-approved drugs specific for lupus nephritis. This gives me a ray of hope and warms my heart that there's more to come. It's important for the right patients to be included in clinical trials so more personalized medicine can be used because lupus is like a fingerprint. I know our feedback and experiences are critically important with regards to research and development and improvements in disease outcomes. I hope to have more treatment options to choose from and more personalized medicine. Thank you for letting me share my voice.
Thank you for both that really powerful perspective and thank you for your service to our country. The last is Tammy Boyd.
Yes. Good morning. For the conflict of interest, Aurinia is a member of and financial contributor to the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, which Black Women Health Imperative chairs. So I wanted to disclose that. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. My name is Tammy Boyd. I'm Chief Policy Officer and Counsel for the Black Women's Health Imperative. We are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing health equity and social justice for Black women across the lifespan through policy, advocacy, education, research, and leadership development. Our organization identifies the most pressing health issues that affect the nation's 22 million women and girls and invests in the best strategies and organizations that can accomplish its goals. Black Women's Health Imperative has appreciated ICER's collaborative engagement throughout its review of the lupus nephritis treatment. The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on African Americans and members of other marginalized communities has been a reminder of the critical importance of reducing healthcare disparities in the US. The decisions ICER makes can either help eliminate or continue to perpetuate healthcare disparities. Our goal, which is to ensure ICER incorporates systematically and sufficiently the lived experiences of non-white patients into the value assessments that payers use to define the contours of access, which is not easy. We ask that any review of the disease states in which health disparities exist be published by ICER only after ICER has incorporated the health and lives of Black and Brown patients into the core of its analysis. Lupus nephritis strikes men and women of all races, but it disproportionately threatens the lives and well-being of women of color at the peak of their childbearing and career potential. When we engage with ICER on this review, we recognize that limited participation among people of color in clinical trials would complicate ICER's ability to consider the differential value of new therapies for Black and Latinx women. We also understood that the traditional approaches to assessing value in racial and/or ethnic subpopulations might have left ICER with the choice to either perform a scenario analysis for Black patients using cost and utility values mirroring the impact of systemic racism, or avoid performing a subpopulation scenario analysis that might otherwise inform patients and clinicians of differences in response to new and existing treatments. Black Women's Health Imperative encouraged ICER to forge a pathway that aligned with its principles of fair access. For women of color, this means that our lives are valued without downward adjustments to account for the weight of systemic racism, and any differential response to or burden from existing treatments are fully considered. And it is imperative that evidence relevant to our health is considered even when our representation in clinical trials does not reflect the real-world disease populations. ICER's inclusion of a subpopulation scenario analysis in lupus nephritis is an important step toward aligning value and equity. We agree with ICER's decision to focus its subpopulation specificity on treatment impact and to treat racial divergence in care, cost, and utility values as extraneous variables rather than legitimate inputs to avoid discounting treatment value based on race. Ideally, scenario analysis would capture all subpopulations with divergent treatment response and/or disease burden. Not meeting that objective in the lupus nephritis report, however, would be a poor justification for backtracking on the meaningful progress ICER has made and can continue to make in addressing health equities and compromise outcomes in people of color. Racial differences in lupus nephritis progression and response to older options are substantial and drive poor outcomes in women of color. The primary driver in heterogeneity in lupus nephritis is race. Disparities in outcome between white and non-white lupus nephritis patients persist even when adjusting for socioeconomic factors. Women of color develop lupus, which we heard earlier, women of color develop lupus at a younger age, experience more serious complications, and have higher mortality rates, up to 3 times the incidence mortality than that of white women. Finally, we would like to emphasize that the scenario analysis in the lupus nephritis draft report provides insight into an equitable approach for valuing emergent treatments in Black, Latinx, and other underserved populations that could encourage enhanced efforts from clinical sponsors to enroll study participants that mirror disease state patient demographics and include outcomes that capture quality of life impacts. We view this issue as high priority. We know ICER would like to improve its approach to address our concerns and request and have appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the lupus nephritis report and subpopulation scenario. We're eager to continue our dialogue.
Thank you so much for those very helpful comments. I guess I would first ask, is there any, just regarding these comments around the scenario analyses, does the ICER staff want to make any response or comments?
Let me just say something general, and then I think we can probably come back to it when we're discussing things just before the votes. I just want to acknowledge how eloquent and on point our commenters were, and I just really appreciate that everybody does. And so, yeah, the issues of scenario analysis, I think, as Tammy said very, very well, it raises questions as well as trying to answer important questions. And so we wrestled with that, and we're really guided and helped by the input of her organization and that of other patient advocates and clinical experts. So we'll come back to that because, as she mentioned too, it didn't help that we were challenged by not having adequate evidence on many of the subpopulations that we really wanted to explore. And we'll bring this back up with clinical experts and others when we talk about the evidence after the break.
Do others have questions either among the CEPAC or the ICER staff, questions or responses from these manufacturer and patient comments?
I know we could also talk about the 6-month scenario that Eric raised about Aurinia's drug. And so I definitely want to come back to that when we talk about the information, the evidence before we take the vote. So even if that's high in mind, let's hold on that because I know we're going to want to spend more time on it.
Trying to make sure I see I don't see any raised hands. So I guess with that, we will release you all for lunch. And I acknowledge being about 10 minutes late. So we will try to reconvene at 12:20.
That's going to make everybody eat fast. Sorry. But I'd rather take time out of our lunch than out of the discussion to come. So with apologies, let's try to reconvene at the appointed time, which is 12:20, and we'll see you then.